Great, thanks Charlie and Meredith. Well, earlier this year, as COVID-19 was changing all of our lives, I called today's speaker to ask him how we should be processing the influx of frightening and often contradictory information about the pandemic. And what I got was a comparative, a broadly comparative, evolutionarily informed framework for assessing, contextualizing, and generally processing the news that was creating so much anxiety and fear in so many around the world. From the global pandemic to the highly consequential socio-political events of the past year, up to and including last week's election, I can think of no topic in greater need of a deep, evolutionarily informed exploration than fear. And no one more qualified to do this than today's speaker, whose recently published book, The Nature of Fear, which is over here somewhere, there we go, presents a critical and profound series of insights on the origin of fear and its consequences in all of our lives. Dan T. Blumstein is professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. And along with me, we co-founded and Dan is co-director of the Evolutionary Medicine Program at UCLA. Dan, welcome to Club EvMed.
Thank you so much, Barb, for the wonderful introduction. I want this to be a discussion later on, so I want this to lead to a discussion. This is a popular book. It's not explicitly an evolutionary medicine book, but that doesn't mean that, as Barb suggested, we can't use this as a starting point for thinking about EvMed. I hope you'll agree with me. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, good, okay. I hope you'll agree with me that understanding our fears is a timely subject. We're the descendants from a long line of fearful ancestors that successfully survived predators. I wrote this book because fear is an emotion that really links us to our past. I used the lens of anti-predator behavior to understand, how animals make decisions. I blend personal experiences collected from over 35 years of fieldwork studying anti-predator behavior and social behavior in animals, and a little bit in humans, around the world. With recent scientific discoveries, I explore the variety of ways in which organisms avoid getting killed by predators and the effects that predators have on their behavior, their morphology, and the ecological communities in which they live. And importantly, I go beyond what typical evolutionary psychologists study, ancestral humans and our primate ancestors, but really capitalize on the full diversity of life to gain insights into this potent emotion. What is fear? Well, it's a highly adaptive neurochemical response that involves specialized parts of the brain, a suite of specialized neural circuits, and a mix of molecules, hormones and other chemicals that travel between nerve cells, across synapses, and through the bloodstream to modulate a wide array of responses. I explicitly view these responses along a continuum of what we might call anxiety, which may heighten vigilance, to fear, which in its extreme really is outright terror. Fear keeps us alive. It kept me alive. I start the book by recounting a story in Kenya years ago. In 1986, I was volunteering to study blue monkeys in Kakamega National Forest in Western Kenya, but I got paid to bicycle around Kenya and was taking some time off from monkey watching and was biking from Mombasa south towards the Tanzanian border to check out some beaches and go to some national parks. And my bike was heavily loaded down. I was bicycling alone, and I see some guys on this deserted stretch of the road, and I say Jambo to them, and they didn't respond. And as I passed them pretty closely, I was biking uphill very slowly, I see them pick up a large rock and hurl it at me. And I sort of, blocked that with my shoulder. I was not knocked over somehow. I don't know how. My bike was really, the center of gravity was really low because my panniers were filled. And I got the best adrenaline rush of my life, and it saved my life. I was able to power up that hill and away from them, terrified that they were chasing me, terrified that they were going to hurt me or kill me. And that opened my eyes to a number of things. It put me into a funk thinking about, how do I assess risk properly? Am I doing the right thing bicycling alone? It also inspired me, wow, what an adrenaline rush. How did that work? I mean, this was eyes open, nostrils open, all energy going to muscle, consequences of a flight or fight, reaction. And you may have had those yourselves when you've been too close, almost hit someone on in a car, or been skiing something and it sort of saved yourself from hitting a tree or something like that. So fear is important, and it's an emotion I think we can all relate to. By taking a broad view, we can begin looking for lessons of life. And one of the main lessons from life is that context influences and should influence our response to threats. So I discussed the sorts of and locations with increased predation risk, and how these areas may vary by species, and some of the factors that influence decisions about whether or not to use habitats. It becomes quite clear that it's impossible to completely avoid risk, and the logic of trade-offs that animals and humans face every day in their quest to survive and leave descendants is a major theme of this book. Armed with this knowledge, we can begin to understand human aesthetics for certain landscapes, and armed with this knowledge, we can improve the daily decisions we make. I then devote 3 chapters to discussing the biological basis for the sight, the sound, and the smell of fear. We are, and should be, and many species are afraid of looming objects. Many species are really good at assessing time to impact. And as objects get bigger, we respond to them by escaping. Frontally pointed eyes, or even eye spots, are particularly evocative for many species because predators often have frontally pointed eyes and binocular vision. Snakes, too, are evocative innately to a number of species, including humans and non-human primates, but other species as well. Snakes have, some people hypothesize, have been really influential in driving human evolution. When I say innately, I'm using this very precisely. Organisms respond appropriately the first time they detect this stimulus. It doesn't mean that subsequent learning isn't important, but you have a decent and modestly effective response the first time you experience something. I think constantly about how we can use these insights to explain things we see around us. In this case, I recount a story of a pet crow that I had. Everyone should have a pet crow. They're super smart. They make us feel stupid. So I rescued a crow years ago when I was a grad student at Davis. I was going to release it the next day, but my major professor and office mate said, no, let's keep it. And I'm like, oh no. So we sort of hand raised this pet crow. The pet crow had never seen snakes. And this was a time when people had tower computers. The crow was really friendly and hung out with us. And it would, but it wanted attention. So it would sort of perch on our shoulders or perch on our chairs while we're working on our computers. And it discovered, those red buttons on those tower computers were like the restart button. And it sort of would peck at that red button, and that would get a response out of us. Not a response it necessarily liked, but it wanted the attention. So we're like desperately, concerned with how can we protect our computers. Crow also was caching food inside the disk drives of the computers, which was not, which was a full employment scheme for computer repair people, but wasn't really good if you're trying to get work done. And one of my office mates noticed that every time the janitor came in, Crow would freak out. He came in with a mop, and she's like, I wonder if it's because it's, the crow's responding to snakes. So she went out and bought tomato steaks and made a little, put them around places she didn't want the crow to be, starting with her computer and then on her desk. And the crow avoided these sticks. The crow never saw snakes before, yet was responding to snake-like objects. We should overreact to things like this, and many species do. I describe how I had a remarkably visceral response to a baby marmot screaming. I study marmots. I run a long-term study of marmots in Colorado. I've studied 8 of the 15 species of marmots around the world. And I'm holding a baby marmot, gently one morning, and it screams, and I almost dropped it. And I was really struck by my emotional response to this vocalization. I've spent much of my career studying alarm calls in animals, and they don't elicit visceral responses in me. Why was I responding to this? And what about screams are evocative? Turns out screams are the result of overblown vocal production systems or sound production systems that are characterized by a suite of what can be called nonlinearities, including things like deterministic chaos, which sound very noisy. Screams and noise capture our attention and matter for many species. Turns out many species detect specific chemicals produced by their predators. Foxes excrete a chemical called TMT in their urine and in their feces, and people have used TMT as part of a fear conditioning protocol to come up with animal models to study PTSD. Felids produce something called PEA. I didn't make this one up. A chemical called P, and the P of felids is sort of innately alarming to many species. I think we could smell these things as well. But one of the things two things that sort of struck out to me when I was researching this chapter was people don't really study the smell of fear in humans, and that's sort of a wide open subject, if for no other reason than to reduce the opportunity for inadvertently stressing humans out when you don't want to stress them out. But I also learned, of course, that there are many, many, many studies of olfactory predator recognition, really good ones in fishes. I discussed the conditions under which animals, at UCLA, I often ask my students, how much would I have to pay you to go have a picnic in a war zone? I started $100 and $1,000, $10,000. How about $100,000? That would pay for your whole UCLA education. If you go to a war zone to have a picnic, $1 million, you could hire Blackwater consultants to provide security and get in and get out. $10 million, what's your price? Everyone has their price. And I introduced the economic logic of behavioral ecology and use the huge literature on flight initiation distance in animals, the distance you can approach an animal before it begins to move away, to understand the dynamics of risk assessment. These lessons have important implications for things like ecotourism, since animals respond fearfully to us as they respond to predators. By understanding the economics of fear, we gain more insights into the trade-offs animals and humans make on their daily basis to enable them and us to live another day. I discussed the conditions under which animals should learn about their predators and the ways in which they should. After all, we're Bayesian and we should use information to update our risk assessments. Despite how nice that wave is, if I saw a shark breach behind me like that, I would not be surfing that wave. And we all should modify our behavior based on current assessments of risks. And this has information, or this has insights into why PTSD is seen in humans, and how humans have one trial learning, and many animals have one trial learning that change their behavior markedly when they experience certain risky events. I discussed the process of habituation, the process by which animals and humans may reduce fearful responses to things that aren't threats, and suggest there may be some general principles underlying what we habituate to. But animals and humans also may sensitize to non-threatening stimuli. And we don't really have a natural history, or we don't really have an evolutionary understanding of what explains necessarily sensitization and habituation. I discussed the benefits of listening to others. Humans tasked with assessing the risk of fearful events will benefit from seeking information from others who share similar risks, and illustrate this from lessons from peacocks and dik-diks, a small monogamous African ungulate that I studied, monkeys and meerkats, and the marmots I've studied for much of my career, all of whom are embedded in complex communication networks with other species, all of which rely on others to collectively assess risk. Listening to others is important. Darwin may have been the first to recognize the ecological effects of predators not only on their prey, but on what their prey eat. I describe such trophic cascades in my Colorado study site, as well as in Yellowstone, outback Australia, and on the islands off Vancouver Island in Canada. Predators have a variety of effects on their ecosystems, both through predation, and we can see in these images here what the habitat looks like in places where predators are present and predators are absent, but also, as I show, based on the fear they exert on their prey. Folk wisdom is often contradictory, and this is really no better illustrated than by the phrases "nothing ventured, nothing gained," or "better safe than sorry." How can we understand when we should follow a "nothing ventured, nothing gained" versus "better safe than sorry" logic in some sense? I introduced the logic of error management theory. that emphasizes the importance of minimizing long-term costs to grapple with this. And I think error management theory is really important in explaining a lot of human behavior and explains a lot of the decisions we face. And as I'm learning now, after writing the book, and thinking about now while writing some other things, error management theory, I think, can be used to explain a number of cognitive biases. So if anyone's ever looked at the Cognitive Bias Codex, many of these are likely evolved biases. They're adaptive. They've evolved for a reason. They keep us safe. They keep us fed. And I think error management theory, minimizing long-term costs, is probably something that is quite useful in this respect in terms of interpreting these biologically. I think we should learn from our inner marmot, as I like to say. And I, write about how instilling fear in others, in voters, can change the outcome of political elections, but it's not always successful in changing human behavior. Why? How can we leverage fear? I show that fear and anxiety have been both successfully and unsuccessfully manipulated to change human behavior, and the conditions under which fear may be an effective agent of change and when it will not be an effective agent of change. In humans, fear seems to motivate change best when the threat is simple to understand, actions have a direct impact on the outcome, and the potential outcome is viscerally repulsive. Disgust, another emotion, is a powerful motivator. And I think this has profound implications on public health messaging. So what are the lessons from life? What have we learned on this journey? I end the book with sort of some lessons, 15 lessons, there could be more, distilled from studies of non-humans and studies of more precisely, human decision-making. Some of these include our perceptions of risk vary as we age. Our decisions are influenced by our pre-existing beliefs. We hate losing and are therefore risk averse. We're more risk averse when we have no control. We fear dreadful, horrific outcomes. We fear the unknown. Our evaluations are the product of natural selection. The scope of damage influences our evaluations. Fear is location specific. Risk is context dependent. We overestimate small risks and underestimate large risks. Sociality can buffer fear. We can learn to fear as well as we can learn not to fear. We acquire information from our entire environment. We are vulnerable to those who manipulate us with fear. And because of this, I think we can, knowledge of this can be used to inoculate us against their often malevolent desires. This is a free immunization. It doesn't have to be kept in -80. We don't have to line up for it. We just have to learn about it. And then I think we can, if we choose to, be inoculated from it. I guess I find it comforting to know that my fear comes from a long line of my ancestors, both human and non-human. It's an inherited treasure, a powerful ally. Yet it's also an annoying and sometimes intolerable companion. It's a compass that, when calibrated properly, can guide us away from danger and towards opportunity. At some level, our relationship with fear is a lesson from life. Since it's impossible to eliminate risk, our fears and anxieties assist us in making the right decisions. Since we can't eliminate them, we should both embrace our fears and challenge them. And Chicago Tribune columnist Mary Schmitz said it quite well in her essay on advice to graduates, which was later turned into a really great song by Baz Luhrmann. Do one thing every day that scares you. And with that, I'm going to open myself up to a scary discussion. But I really, I want this to be a discussion. I don't want this to only be questions. If you have a point to make, don't frame it as a question. Make that point. If you have something to contribute, particularly on insights on how these insights can be used for medicine and beyond public health, let's talk about those. And I guess we'll start first with some challenges Barb's going to throw at me, which we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to unshare now, and then we can sort of see each other a little better. So thanks for coming, everybody.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Dan. That was fantastic. And I think many of us have lots of questions. And I actually think I'm going to give the first question. We have people raising their hands, and I would love to hear from them, and then I'll jump in as well. But I see, let's see, Meredith, I saw Dan Lieberman's hand up. And Dan Lieberman, if you're still there, do you want to jump in? And Meredith, if you could queue up other hands, that'd be awesome.
Sure. I think it's appropriate for Dan to ask the first question to Dan. So great, thanks for the talk, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
So I have a question about differences between human fear and other animals. So it seems to me one of the most pernicious forms of fear is that we often are afraid of things that might happen, rather than things that are imminently about to happen or have happened. And is there any evidence that other species are capable of this kind of prediction?
So, I mean, humans are unique in many ways, and people like Joseph Ledoux, who have studied fear for many years and anxiety for many years in non-human model systems, more in his more recent writings, has sort of come out and said that only humans can have fear, and we shouldn't even use the words fear and anxiety. I think that in some sense is kind of a cop-out in the sense that, and partly he says it's because we can anticipate in maybe ways that other animals can't anticipate. I'm not suggesting that we feel and respond the same ways that other animals fear and respond, although there are good physiological commonalities between us and other species. But certainly when an animal, either has an evolved predisposition to avoid certain habitats, it's anticipating something bad happening there. Or when animals learn that, cover is either risky or protective, it's anticipating that something bad or good can happen there. So I think it's okay to sort of roll with that and sort of try to understand and sort of see that maybe other animals are anticipating good things or bad things can happen in certain areas. And at that level, I'm not asserting, and nor do I wish to assert, that a marmot experiences fear in the exact same way that I experience fear, but rather there are enough commonalities to allow us to look at really the evolution of these things, and that we aren't really, de novo in our ways that we, respond to risks and fears.
Well, maybe, I mean, in the spirit, because maybe I wonder if sometimes we're so afraid of anthropomorphizing, so to speak, other species, that we have prevented ourselves from investigating some comparative aspects of fear. Like my dog, for example, there's no question that she picks up on cues that make her upset because things might happen. Like if she sees a suitcase, she knows that somebody might leave, right? And I'm wondering if we actually underestimate just how much these kinds of phenomena occur, because we can't ask our dogs about anxiety, right?
Right. So as Dan knows, academic books, are peer reviewed. Harvard sends it out for peer reviewers. Some of the peer reviewers were sort of questioning the anthropomorphism here. Well, so I ended up writing about anthropodenialism that other people have written about. So I think we can go off the rails in a bad way by denying that other non-humans, don't have something. View it as a hypothesis if you wish, but I think view it also as a tool to help us understand, our behavior and other animals' behavior. And if it helps us understand it, maybe there's something there. And I think that clearly, my dog as well was freaking out when it was raining the other day. Why? Because rain's associated with thunder, and he was one trial fear conditioned with a clap of thunder to, be afraid of this big monster outside. And the sound of fear is potent. In this case, I think it's because animals are pretty good at assessing body size based on vocalization frequencies. And, he was a little badass corgi. And when he heard his first clap of thunder, he's like, there's something bigger out there. And, lost it forever after. So, I think we should view all of these ideas as hypotheses worth testing. So yes, let's not overreact and deny that we are connected to our ancestors.
Can I jump in for just a second? Because to Dan L's point, if in fact anthropomorphism is the projection of human characteristics onto animals in ways that are not scientifically justifiable, I think that's a really great opportunity to begin considering just how highly conserved the biological systems that underlie fear are across at least mammals and frankly, across vertebrates, from autonomic nervous system and HPA, axes, etc. So to that, Dan B, I wonder if you could just comment on something I've wondered about for a long time, which is whether we can look at such autonomically mediated human psychiatric disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, in the context of extreme adrenergic fear learning in animals, what that connection might be and where the limitations might be.
Yeah, so I mean, I think people are using fear conditioning rats and using that as a model to develop therapies against PTSD to prevent memories from consolidating. And one of my colleagues at UCLA, Michael Fanslow, argues that he's not, his fear conditioning where he pairs electric shock with a stimulus and animals, rats learn immediately to fear those stimuli. He argues that this is not a model for PTSD. This is PTSD. So clearly, people are using this commonality, similar underlying mechanistic basis of fear across vertebrates, at least, but really across the animal kingdom, to try to address and understand and develop therapies against PTSD. And he and others have been successful in some ways.
Jillian Pepper, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. Hi, this is really interesting to me, and I've got a little bit of a pet project research-wise, which is that I'm interested in what I refer to as perceived extrinsic mortality risk in humans. And when I use the term extrinsic there, what I mean is not necessarily in the traditional life history sense of kind of mortalities by external causes, but specifically risks of mortality that are beyond behavioral control. So things that might kill you that by changing your behavior, you cannot really prevent, and the effects of that. And what I'm finding in humans in the few studies that I've done is that perceiving risks that are beyond your control seems to be associated with a decrease in sort of healthful behavior. So it's effectively, if you perceive there's something that you can do nothing about that might kill you, you're less likely to, take up running, quit smoking, cut back on the drinking, etc. And what I'm really, so this came out of a behavioral ecological model in which we predicted that this might happen, a sort of a behavioral analog to disposable soma theory, but in a developmental sense within a lifetime. And what I'm really curious about, there's loads of lovely literature in the animal world that sort of shows if you actually manipulate extrinsic mortality over generations, you get differences in things like life expectancy and age at reproduction, for example. But I wonder if there are any changes behaviorally in animals based on cues to predators or anything that would be sort of a comparative thing in the animal kingdom to what I think I'm seeing in humans.
I mean, I talk about really fascinating work with lynx and snowshoe hares. So lynx and snowshoe hares are one of these classic population biology, examples where as the hare population goes up, the lynx population follows them, and then the hare population crashes and the lynx crash. And so people have studied aspects of this lynx hare dynamic, and lynx hares can be scared by predators, and that can suppress their reproduction alone, not by having actual predation, but by the risk of predation, perceived predation. I talk about other cases where the sound of fear can reduce reproductive success in organisms and stress them out in various ways, and has a suite of other characteristics. I think that's somewhat analogous to what you're talking about, but in terms of the control, I think that this is more direct in the sense that animals detecting predators either have a physiological stress response that has consequences, in that next generation and maybe even across generations, but also that it changes their behavior directly without the actual predation being involved. I don't know if that addresses your study. We should probably talk more about this later because I think it's really fascinating. But those are things that are happening in the animal kingdom, at least.
Okay, thank you. Do you cover any of that sort of thing in your book potentially?
Yeah, talk about those exactly.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I see we have a question which from Daniela Seif about the difference between fear of conspecific, sort of social perhaps fear versus predatory fear. But I think Danielle also has a hand up. So Daniela, are you?
Yeah, no, it's the same question, but it's just
good.
Dan's work seems to focus on, he's talking a lot about fear of predators. And I'm just wondering how much you look at fear that comes from conspecifics, dangers, and whether there's a different quality to that, whether you think that's evolved later, whether it's just the same thing, you're going to, dominance or be thrown out of a group or be attacked by an infanticidal male or something, but whether there's a difference in that quality and how you would see the relationship between fear and conspecific.
Right, that's a great question. So, I mean, clearly, these are different domains, but I mean, evolution acts by tinkering, and you work with underlying, mechanisms that you have. So there may be other endocrinological systems involved in modulating social behavior, and there's some really cool work, coming out now showing, specific genes, serotonin genes are associated with affiliation in many species, et cetera. But when someone's chasing you, and you're being beaten up, we see fear responses. We also see increases in glucocorticoid responses, when many animals are, not all animals, some animals are, are subordinate, are being threatened by other conspecifics. So even in the social domain, this can lead to fears, which raises a really interesting question. Is fear of social failure really the same thing? Is fear that my toenails are yellow and I need to go out and buy that anti-yellowing toenail, cream, which marketers, try to tap into our fears to get us to do, the same fear. And, at some sense, parts of it are and parts of it are probably different. And maybe the parts that are enough to, because, if you lose your home, if you lose your status, that can lead to major problems in your future fitness. And these fear systems in general, are fight or flight, but they're also tied in with trying to keep us alive in general and try to keep us to be able to have fitness. So I think there are other systems involved in social anxiety and social fears, but in some cases, they're usurping some of the same pathways.
Thank you.
And I guess from a therapeutic point of view, then there's a really interesting question. How far can we go? How much can we learn from anti-predator related fears and stress related, those sorts of predatory stresses for managing and treating social anxieties and things like that? And I'm sure Randy has some good comments on that.
Randy, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, that's timely, Dan. I can't wait to read your book, and I'd like to talk with you separately about making sure the Anxiety Disorders Association of America get you on their roster. And there's a Gordon conference that meets out in California every year about these exact things, which you're probably participating in. But since you probably know, I've helped to run an anxiety clinic for 30 years, and these ideas were not in my repertoire for the first 10 years. After I started explaining the smoke detector principle to people, that helped a lot. But I'm especially curious about your take on animals and the sensitization aspect, because this seems to me to be an unexplored opportunity in terms of if you're repeatedly exposed to a danger and what you're doing so far is not protecting you sufficiently, then the threshold goes down, your sensitivity goes up, and this is the kind of thing that leads to that positive feedback cycle that turns ordinary anxiety into an anxiety disorder. I'll bet you know a lot about that, and I'd love to learn more.
So I'm going to sort of modify that slightly, because sensitization and habituation are, in theory, responses to non-threatening stimuli. And one of the insights that is beginning to come out of my studies and others is that individuals respond differently to repeated non-threatening stimuli. So many of the studies of flight initiation distance, how close you can get to something before it flies, slithers, or hops off, are on unmarked animals. So you do a one trial and then you move on and do another trial. And you can see that animals in urban areas, seemingly are more habituated than animals in rural areas. You can get closer to them. You can find all these amazing comparative insights when you start looking at the thousands of studies that have been done. However, when you start looking at individuals and how individuals respond to repeated approaches, and you start fitting the right statistical models that really allow you to look at individual responses over time, you find that some individuals, maybe the population as a whole habituates, tolerates closer approach, but not all individuals do. Some individuals sensitize, and I don't think we know why. And I think there's a whole full employment scheme out there to understand individual differences. And I think that's a huge issue in human behavior as well. And I think, you know, humans clearly recognize that individuals differ. Animal behaviorists are sort of catching up on this with the idea of personalities. But I actually think that if asked the right way, the insights that people studying animals in the wild, you know, are generating with respect to this could be really useful in understanding more of the biological basis of individual differences about, you know, fears and anxieties in humans as well. One trial learning, you know, is good. I mean, PTSD is horrible, but, you know, learning, you know, to avoid situations that will kill you effectively is a good thing. The trauma that comes associated with it isn't so good. But, you know, that's a challenge.
Great, thank you. And Emerald Esme Snow has a hand up.
Hi there. Yeah, nice to see everybody and nice to be here. I work in public health and social services, so I'm always here. Whenever I come here, I'm always thinking about implications or potential implications for my work. So I'm just going to read my question because I think I wrote it much better than I'd be able to say it. So I and others have often felt that xenophobic, anti-outsider, ultra-nationalist political groups or endeavors, or even anti-science movements or endeavors utilize fear-based tactics that are often successful, I feel, and it seems that they utilize and really benefit from the most fearful psychological biases. So I'm just wondering if you have any comment on this, and especially in regard to the health and healthy political development for people who are maybe particularly vulnerable to that kind of messaging.
So this is one of those biases. I mean, in-group, out-group biases are highly adaptive. I've just read and I'm now just reviewing a colleague's book, Dominic Johnson's book on strategic, oh geez, I forget what it's called, but it's basically about looking at 3 biases, viewing them as evolved biases, in-group, out-group biases, strategic ambitions, I think it's called, the fundamental attribution error, and something else, and then sort of going in and sort of saying, well, you know, do these work and how do they work? And he looks at international relations as sort of his palette where he applies this evolved toolkit to sort of try to understand, you know, how this can work. And it works really well. His example of in-group, out-group biases was the Pacific Theater in World War II that, you know, was responsible for 30% of American, you know, fatalities. And we vilified Japanese and the atrocities committed there and the direct attacks on citizens that were not used in the same way to the same scale in the European theater, you know, were because we at a governmental level and an individual level and boots on ground level vilified and were taught to vilify the Japanese. So in-group, out-group biases are something, you know, that's there, and we need to deal with that one. And people are vulnerable to it, and people respond to it. And you can see the outcome of that in our current political crisis and situation in the U.S. right now. It works. Fear sells in that, and it's an easy sell. And I think it's a really cheap sell. And I think it's sort of dismissive of this beautiful evolutionary commonality we have with other organisms, but it works. And I think we can inoculate ourselves against that, but it's an uphill battle. And I think we need to inoculate ourselves against this. And I think one way of inoculating ourselves against this is to sort of appeal to our slow decision-making process rather than our fast decision-making process. And, you know, really pulling out and discussing and describing what are these risks? Is every alien, is every refugee who's leaving a horrible situation and trying to come to the US, are they really creating sleeper cells? Of course they're not. They're looking for a better life. Is every person really trying to invade our country and be criminals? Of course not. The vast majority of these people aren't. This is about calibrating our risk assessment to reality and not having some knee-jerk response and capitalizing on that knee-jerk response. But people, are pretty good at, having these knee-jerk responses and letting that guide our decision-making, which is silly, but understandable. I mean, context influences things. So, I mean, from a public health perspective, something I'm thinking about a lot is, your absolute risk of having bad consequences from COVID vary based on your age and, pre-existing conditions and things like that. One message will not work for everyone, and we should not believe one message will work for everyone. Capitalizing on our in-group, out-group stuff, creating competitions for full mask wearing, full compliance, full voting. Wouldn't that be interesting? At the municipal level, at the regional level, at the university level, hey, instead of having a sports event, season, instead of having Division I athletics, let's have Division I COVID smashing. What university is going to have in-person classes and is going to have the least COVID out there? Why don't we capitalize on that? And that's going to be a great in-group, out-group bias that is going to, spur collective action. So I think that there are ways of reframing some of these things. I'm trying to sell an op-ed right now with a colleague to the, that looks at gamifying social problems like this.
Melis, a question, a hand up from Melis. Okay,
Can
we'll
I
go.
speak instead?
There we go.
Can I speak instead?
I like all the Dans and Daniels talking. This is great. Go for it.
Great.
Go ahead, Daniel.
This goes back to talking about dogs being able to anticipate. You didn't mention Pavlov. I don't know how, because what it strikes me is that almost any, even an artificial releaser for the behavior starts the story of Pavlov's dog. But you in your book go into loud screams or discordant sounds or a smell or something. The system seems to be that the anticipation departs from that event, which is fantastic. Now, what I'm thinking about in the therapeutic sphere for public health or personal health, how do you set up a scenario the patient can go for sufficiently, who's not terrified out of his wits, but can deal with on a more, as you put it, a slow, considered basis than the shock that was the original problem that may be buried way in his past. It might have been his mother scared him. How do you set up a scenario which he can then machine, you can work your way through?
I don't know, but that's a great question. And I think that's a great way of thinking about, therapies to, potentially deal with anxiety disorders and other things, or, treatments in general. I mean, we're all afraid of if we have something impending, surgical, medical treatment with, that has consequences. We're all concerned about that.
Well, a bedside manner might help. They tell you exactly what they're going to do before they do it.
But that might vary based on individuals as well. So I think something to learn from non-humans is that individuals vary, which is ironic. We're learning it from non-humans because we know humans all vary. But that non-humans vary, that all animals vary individually. Their individuality is where we look for it, and we find it in all sorts of species, particularly with respect to responses to threats and responses to potentially fearful events.
There's a question from Terrence Taylor, both on the hand up and also on the chat. Terrence, are you available to speak?
Turn on your mic, Terry. Mic's off.
You're muted, Terry.
Okay, well, Terry's working on that. let's see, Melis? No, okay,
Yeah.
no,
Yes.
I've got it.
okay,
Go.
great.
Sorry. Sorry, I was
go back
muted
to
a
me?
second ago.
There we go, there's Sarah.
Sorry, which one would you like to respond?
Go for it, Terry.
Okay, Dan,
Yep.
thank you so much for your wonderful book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And as you know, I'm seized of this subject of living with risk is the way I look at it. And I was fascinated, really going on your chapter on economic logic, where I got the sense of going along a spectrum. And I was wondering where fear as an emotion, as humans understand it, appears along that spectrum. I see a neurochemical immediate, which provokes an immediate reaction. There's a reflex action of some kinds. And then you get to a point, as you say in that chapter, about doing a risk calculation, particularly in relation to I think in another part of the book about distance you away from birds before they reacted to yours and your co-researcher's response. So I was wondering if looking at fear along a spectrum, which begins with a sort of automatic, then semi-automatic, then calculated. Have I seized that the right way? Then I have a couple of
I think there's ways of thinking about fear along a spectrum of anxiety, which might be associated with increasing vigilance. But nonetheless, animals are using cues they can perceive to come up with some really gestalt of, some assessment of, the probability of X happening. But they have to trade that off with the probability of other things happening. After all, animals, and the way I frame it in the book is, it's convenient as a behavioral ecologist to sort of view there are two ways of dying. You can starve to death because you never leave the safety of your home or burrow, or you can be killed if you go outside and are incautious. And it's really trading those things off, the risk of starvation versus the risk of predation. It's a powerful way to think about decisions, and that individuals can assess the same risks, but have to go about their daily life. Now, Terry has a storied career as a military officer, who understands that viscerally. To some extent, when I was in Pakistan after, I was in Pakistan I did my PhD research in Pakistan, but I was in Peshawar at a time, lovely city, but at a time where the Afghan secret police and the former Soviets were blowing up buses in the city. So there were a lot of terrorist attacks. And, I'm hopping on a bus and I'm like, is this going to be my last bus ride? And I'm sort of wondering, how do I live with this risk? And if you go to places where people are living under, in horrible situations with terrorist attacks and things like that, you got to go about your daily business. And I had heightened anxiety and fear the whole time I was there. But if you want to go eat, if you want to go shopping, you got to go outside. Yeah. So risk can be assessed, but you trade it off against other things, is the way I think about these decisions.
Well, it led me to the next thing, and your last slide I looked at. Humans indulge in seeking risky behavior they indulge in. And there are negative aspects to that, but there are also positive ones that we use in a positive way, knowing that humans are ready to indulge in risk. How is this seen? Is it a form of training? Are there reflections in the animal world on this aspect of indulging in risk that might prepare one for some future event rather than an immediate one?
Play is defined as behavior that is apparently immediately purposeless, but is thought that involves actions and activities, normally mixing potential, functional groups, that is reciprocal in many cases for social play, but that prepares animals for future events. And it's sort of hard to demonstrate how play really works. But at the end of the day, play is risky. And what we see when animals are playing, predators play chase each other, and prey pounce on each other, and prey kill each other. Prey animals may play flee, escaping predators. But by running around, you're not paying attention to what's going on around you. My own work with marmots has shown that animals that are playing are doing whatever they can to reduce that risk of predation by not being cautious. Animals have, pretty much all animals studied have a limited amount of attention. And the same way we can focus our attention on one task, but by doing so, we can't focus our attention on other tasks. We see the same thing in non-human species. And what we see when they're engaged in playing, which presumably has benefits later in life, is they play closer to safe places. They play at safe times of the day. They minimize risk. They compensate for risks. And I think what we see in nature is a lot of risk compensation. I think one of the public health messages coming out for COVID these days is you got a risk budget. You know, if you're going to go shopping, you probably shouldn't have a party. If you're going to go to a bar, I hope no one's going to bars, you know, you probably shouldn't see your grandparents, etc. That risk will catch up with you and will bite you. And thinking about how we manage risk and trade off risk for immediate benefits or necessary things, you know, I think is a useful metaphor, but also a useful rule that we see other animals using throughout the animal kingdom.
Thanks. I have about 10 other questions, but I'll step aside for others.
We've got great questions. I don't know if any of the people who have written their questions in the chat want to raise hands, but if not, I can read a couple of them.
Let's go to Melis. She's had her hand raised. I think she's ready to ask now.
Fantastic.
Yes. So, hi. Sorry, my microphone was muted a second ago.
Okay.
So we talk about fear. So fear is through evolution. If there was a selective advantage, which is watching out for predators, for example, then it's evolved through the years. And we talk about anxiety and PTSD, which is the overdriven nervous system that creates irrational fear. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there's psychopathy, like psychopaths that do not feel fear the same level as humans. And obviously they can't risk assess as better as humans. So how has that evolved? Do you mention anything about that in your book?
Let's look at the evolution of psychopaths. No, I don't. Yeah, so parse that question again, please.
It wasn't really a question. I just wanted maybe an opinion on, because I think it's fascinating how evolution, for a trait to evolve, there needs to be a selective advantage. But what's the selective advantage for psychopathy? Because there's more risk taking, there's a decreased neurochemical response and reduced functioning of the amygdala, and basically doesn't have an advantage for humans.
Well, it may. I mean, Bernie Crespi's written about this and studied this a bit, I think. And, you know, there's sort of a continuum of sort of excessively extroverted, introverted. I mean, a lot of these things act on continua. Maybe an extreme appears maladaptive, but maybe an extreme is adaptive in some consequences. Leaders that only care about themselves may do really well if they create a cult of personality. So, you know, I don't know. One of the things we need to think about, and is really a challenge for humans, is the context. So I talk about evolutionary mismatches, and you know, mismatch, of course, is a huge issue in evolutionary medicine. But you know, what are the conditions under which a particular expression of a trait is adaptive, and how should that vary in different contexts? And you know, are we have we created such an artificial world around us now that that we're seeing more mismatches in some extent, or we're creating more things that we might perceive as problems? So I think these are important things to sort of consider when we're sort of viewing traits as pathologies. Bernie, do you have any? I see you now. Do you have any comments on the psychopath? Because you've thought about this a bit.
Well, no, I think you've hit that right. I mean, it could be a fast life history theory sort of situation, the fast, slow spectrum that Marco Del Giudice has talked about. One can also think about a continuum in terms of there must be people out there who feel very little fear. And the question becomes, well, what sort of costs and benefits are associated with people who have very reduced levels of fear? And these sorts of extremes can sometimes, I think, be very valuable in helping us understand the costs and benefits. But as far as things like psychopathy are concerned, people often talk about frequency dependent effects and cheating in social systems. And certainly fear could be a considerable component of that sort of personality adaptation.
Thanks, Bernie. I'm going to just jump in and thank Dan Blumstein for a spectacular talk and really engaging conversation. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I want to just show Dan's book right here, which is The Nature of Fear. It's a beautiful cover, actually, and just a wonderful book, as his talk really gives us a little taste of. So with that, Charlie and Meredith.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dan. That was fantastic. And this is exactly what we're hoping for with Club EvMeds. There were so many great questions. I don't think we asked a single question from the chat this time, and there are probably about 20 in there and some really good discussions going on in there. So thank you all very much for coming and for participating. Before we leave, I want to share with you the upcoming Club EvMeds. I'll share my screen quickly. Hopefully you're seeing our website and the presentation that we just heard from Dan Blumstein. Next week we have Sylvia Kramer, and I see you're on today, Sylvia. Thank you for joining. Who's going to be talking about social immunity, cooperative defense, and social insect colonies, and she has some colleagues who are coming with her. And that's on, note that it's a different time each week. It can be a different time and day. That's on Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And then after that, we have Michael Rose and Grant Rutledge talking about age dependence and evolutionary mismatch. So, and we have more coming up after that. So please do stay tuned. We hope to see you again next week and in all of the weeks. And thanks again, Dan, and thank you, Barb, and thank you, Meredith.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Great discussion.